There can be only one.
Starting out as a fantasy film all the way back in 1986, Highlander is one of the most popular American media franchises of all time. It began with Connor MacLeod's journey in the Scottish Highlands in the 16th century before evolving into a full-fledged empire with theatrical films, made-for-television films, television series, anime films, comics, novels, and so on. While the franchise is widely successful, every collection has a couple of misses or forgotten media that are buried under the constantly flowing releases that overpower them. This franchise is no exception to this rule, and in 2015, the Highlander 3030 comic series was released to focus on Duncan MacLeod's life in a distant dystopian future. However, it was poorly received by critics, and only one issue was released digitally, making it a much lesser-known story within the Highlander franchise. Today, I shall attempt to change that as I take you on a journey with Duncan MacLeod and tell you everything we know about Highlander 3030.
A very nice effort, young Duncan MacLeod, of the Clan MacLeod.
Who is Duncan MacLeod, and why should you care? Before I get into any details, I am sure you must be wondering who even is Duncan MacLeod and why he is important enough for us to care about his storyline in the larger Highlander universe. Well, as it turns out, Duncan MacLeod is an immortal who went on to become one of the most powerful, noble champions of this universe. In fact, he was the second immortal to bear the title of Highlander, and his exploits were such that he was nothing short of a legend. Born all the way back in December 1592, Duncan MacLeod ended up on Ian MacLeod's doorsteps, who claimed this infant and took him in after his wife, Mary, had unfortunately birthed a stillborn. In this way, the MacLeod clan kept the stillborn's history a secret, and instead raised Duncan as their own baby in a hamlet near Glenfinnan. Duncan grew up to be a spirited young boy and even shared many teenage adventures with his cousin brother, Robert MacLeod. On one such adventure in 1606, they had an unfortunate accident in Dunnan Wood when Robert panicked and ran away after encountering a wolf. Even though they were trying to hunt the animal down, the sight of it was enough to send Robert into a panicked state, while Duncan stayed behind and eventually found himself in an isolated setting. Here he came across a secluded house where a strange woman declared that he was special, and even took him in after saving him from Kantos. This lady turned out to be none other than Cassandra, the mysterious witch of Dunnan Wood, who cared for him until it was safe for him to return to his father. This was the first of many adventures, and in 1618 Duncan experienced a rather traumatic blow when his teenage love, Deborah Campbell, was set to marry his cousin, Robert. The young boy did everything in his power to prevent this, but eventually he admitted defeat and made his peace with losing Deborah. As a parting gift, he gave her a bracelet, and this trinket also did not sit well with Robert. In fact, he was so enraged that he challenged Duncan to a fight to the death, even if the outcomes were not in his favor. Since he had no other option but to fight fairly, the duel resulted in Robert's death, and Duncan was so mortified when he came to terms with the guilt of killing his close friend that he even refused to marry Deborah afterwards. To make matters worse, Deborah was so taken aback by the entire ordeal that she made a beeline for the nearest cliff to jump off it, and Duncan rushed to save her life. Just when he thought that she had been talked out of this decision, the cliff collapsed under her feet and she fell to her death, while Duncan witnessed the horror and was left with no option but to bury her in an unconsecrated grave, since it was a suicide. When I think about the tragedies of his early life, it makes sense that he was such a hardened soldier, especially since he had been dealing with death and losses for as long as he could remember. However, Duncan himself was immune to death, and had been blessed with eternity, and he first experienced this during Clan MacLeod's War in 1622. Duncan was injured in battle and soon carried home when he succumbed to his injuries, after which his father returned to the battlefield with other warriors. However, Duncan's corpse soon came back to life, while a local woman witnessed this miracle, and his terrified father then believed the resurrection to be a demonic activity. He even went as far as to disown Duncan, who was only trying to make sense of this miracle as well. In a state of depression, he wandered across the Highlands all by himself and survived by scavenging for food and water until he ran into his father once again. He even tried to make amends, but Ian did not wish to hear him out and instead decided to reveal the truth about them finding him on their doorsteps. However, Duncan refused to hear the truth about his adoption and reiterated that he was a MacLeod before continuing to fight in many more battles. A couple of years later, the clan was targeted by a Viking warrior named Conwulf, and the clash was so severe that Ian sustained many fatal wounds during battle. While his father was on his deathbed, Duncan came back to his home and reconciled with Mary before stepping up to take his father's claymore and even avenge his death. He rode out and killed many of the bandits, which was around the first time that he experienced the buzz. However, he did not pay much attention to this sensation and continued his fight until he faced Conwolf and impaled him. Unfortunately, he was unaware of the fact that Conwolf was also an immortal, and that he would return to life if he did follow the process of beheading him and then burying his axe. While Duncan believed that he had avenged Ian's death, he returned to the wilderness once again, only for the buzz sensation to return and guide him to a cave. It was here that he finds a hermit who declares Duncan to be the Chosen One, and even states that he will soon meet his mentor, Connor MacLeod. Moreover, the hermit even prophesies that he must prepare for future battles with ancient evils before taking out his own sword and revealing himself to be Timothy of Gilliam. In an experience that Duncan would only remember in bits and pieces, Timothy takes Duncan's sword and beheads himself with it in a process known as the quickening. Wait, Highlander had comics? While that was all about Duncan's history, I am sure you must be thinking about how he ended up being a part of Highlander comics. Scratch that. I believe you must wonder if Highlander even had comics, and the answer to that is that the franchise did have a couple of unfortunate comic runs. Starting in 2006, Dynamite Entertainment ran a year-long comic series that split 13 issues across 3 graphic novels. This original run included releases such as The Coldest War, Dark Quickening, and Armageddon, and it also received generally favorable reviews from fans and critics alike. These comics also had some continuity with the films, but the sales continued to decline sharply with each issue's release, and the studios finally called the project off after 13 issues. After some time, Highlander 3030 was announced as an indie attempt to revive this IP, and if you're thinking that this is an obscure idea, don't worry. You're not the only one who thinks so. Highlander 3030 was published by Emerald Star Comics in 2015, and they even held a contest to determine an individual whose likeness would have made it into the story as a character. However, the project was over in the blink of an eye, and only one singular issue made it to the public before it was called off. Okay, so what was Highlander 3030? Written by Lynette Williams and Matt Kelly, Highlander 3030 was published by Emerald Star Comics and officially licensed by the franchise. The comic began with art submissions by Dan Goodfellow that show rough sketches before jumping right into the action and introducing Duncan MacLeod as the Highlander. The comic panel introduces him as an immortal warrior who had been born all the way back in 1592 in the Scottish Highlands before narrating his tale as a lover, a wanderer, and an immortal who had fought numerous others of his kind in battle. In the present day, in 3030, he appears to be over 1,400 years old, and at a point where he feels the burden of his power, knowledge, and all the losses he has incurred over the years. However, every passionate warrior might rise above their feelings when the battle alarm rings, and this story soon places him on Europa, at an extrasolar transfer station BX-3, as he fights against a rather cocky opponent, Jason. Duncan expresses his disappointment in Jason and even asks him if he has any last words before he slays his head after dominating the entire encounter, while Jason continues to mock Duncan's sword. However, Duncan remains calm and composed as he explains that guns often fail, while also giving Jason one chance to fight with the promise that he will be dead in no time if he fails. He has zero fear of the gun, and a multi-era montage across World Wars I and II to the Second Martian Independence War in the future, in 2499, gives us a glimpse of how Duncan has often seen guns fail. Every single time that Duncan finds himself at the receiving end of a firearm, there are malfunctions that can only be explained by the rules of immortal combat, fate, and destiny. His nature as an immortal ensures his survival, especially since they are fated to fight blade to blade. Soon enough, the comic shifts to the sovereign nation of Rakot, where an incoming attack injures a warrior named Annika. While she is left for the dead, it is soon revealed that she has survived vacuum exposure, suffocation, and freezing before making it out alive. Her hardened nature reflects the spirit of the immortals, and her origin story shows the birth of a new immortal when their first death triggers the realization of their eternal fate. Before the story takes us back to Europa, it is also important to note just how Rakot has become a futuristic dystopia, where the fractured colony structure, labor tensions, mining operations, and authoritarian governance have turned the place into a late-stage capitalist hell. Thankfully, Annika seems to have escaped this dystopia, and the story soon shifts to Europa, where Duncan speaks with a holographic woman who brings the name MacLeod into discussion and even hints at betrayal and slow death. These scenes build the story even before Krav makes an appearance by highlighting how immortal politics are still alive in 3030. From intact memories to enemies, this holographic woman only adds to the mystery and tension, as Duncan has a flashback to about 120 years ago, when someone has suggested that he must dye his hair. Although he had retained his natural appearance, this scene doubles down on how Duncan believes his gray hair to be a reminder of everything he had lost. Instead of giving in to vain whimsy, Duncan makes a conscious choice to remember all the losses and pain, which is a rather impressive character trait for an immortal, especially when you compare it with the ageless warrior archetype maintained by Connor MacLeod. While he runs his fingers through his gray hair, the story takes him back to a fight on the Earth colony of Vega in 2741 AD. Two immortals clashing, blades crossing, and sparks flying from everywhere. This battle is an attempt to link this comic to the franchise's overall energy, and it reinforces the eternal nature of the game, even in the depths of deep space. In the present day in 3030, a 1400-year-old Duncan is roused back into action due to an incoming transport, Rykot 4 X-ray, approaching Europa. As he rushes to the scene, the rest of his crewmates are shocked to see him jump into action to save Annika, while they observe her and conclude that she might have suffocated and then frozen during this ordeal. However, she soon snaps back into action, much to everyone's horror, and her arrival also seems to be a brand new source of trouble, as they sense another incoming shuttle pulling into their orbit. While Duncan helps her regain her senses, the shuttle emergency becomes increasingly more important as it brings along another immortal, Krav. The shuttle reveal plays out like a cliffhanger, and it almost jerks Duncan back into the game as the buzzing in his head gets increasingly prominent and he instinctively recognizes that the game is still alive and ongoing. While Annika's awakening and Europa politics add to the comic issue, the idea that the other immortals continue to exist even after attempts to isolate oneself from the game is a central theme for this issue. It goes to show that civilizations may evolve, guns might fail, and time may erode attachments, but at the end of the day, blades continue to matter as the game goes on. From Duncan's conscious decisions to carry the emotional weight of aging even as an immortal to Annika's awakening and Krav's shocking appearance, this comic was a medium to highlight Duncan's reawakening as another worthy immortal, Krav, rouses him back into battle. At the same time, it also does a wonderful job of exploring the dystopian atmosphere of Europa and Rykot, as Duncan helps save Annika as she tries to figure out the truth about her identity, while also continuing to fight and accept his fate as an immortal for whom the game must always go on. I am sure you must be thinking that a comic as intriguing as this one deserved to be continued, and frankly, it is a sad thought to me as well. Besides having a solid plot and themes ranging from dystopia, sci-fi, and politics to even labor unrest and immortality, this comic even went out of its way to appeal to fans by arranging a contest where a fan's likeness was turned into a character. Finally, it even got a shout-out from the official Highlander Facebook account that made it a part of canon, which made the comic's failure even more striking. So, how did it all fall apart? I am sure you must be wondering what exactly went so wrong for the comic to be such a flop, especially since it seems to have a somewhat decent plot. Well, it so happened that the comic's first issue received poor reviews from critics upon its digital release, and the response was so negative that they halted production on the entire comic. During an interview with the podcast 10 Cent Takes, writer Matt Kelly further revealed that the comic faced several other production problems, including the initial artist dropping out due to health issues. Soon enough, Davis Panzer Productions brought in artist Dan Goodfellow to design the comic and insists that he draw it in a style that was not his own. This decision truly affected the comic's overall reception, and the book was such a commercial failure that it never saw the light of day after Emerald Star Comics went out of business. And now it's just gone? Since the comic does not have any secure distributors, the digital comics that were on sale through Drive-Thru Comics and Comixology are also no longer on sale. Officially, the comic does not have any marketplaces or channels for commercial availability, and even the published issues number 1A and number 1B are not accessible. After Drive-Thru Comics and Comixology especially took down their old listings, these issues cannot be secured even through secondary marketplaces, as there were no physical copies. Moreover, the comic's second issue was also never completed, making Highlander 3030 one of those partially lost, or rather fully lost media that have essentially vanished from the market. And on that note, I sadly conclude this video about the Highlander 3030 comics, which have been largely forgotten over time. While the comic did have some promise, and there is no doubt that Duncan MacLeod made for an interesting character, sometimes the production gods are just not on the creator's side. Big franchises like Highlander are always bound to have a couple of releases that might slip under the radar, or just underperform to an extent where they are not really considered as part of canon, even though they officially are, and it is unfortunate that this comic fell victim to this fate. However, I hope that this video gave you some glimpse into a rather lost comic, and I would love to hear what you think of it in the comments below.